Okay, good, you're good. We're good. Step right, step back forward.
At 2:14 a.m., the lights inside a quiet office complex on the edge of Washington, D.C. went dark. Not because of a power failure, because federal agents had just taken control. Within seconds, communication lines were cut. Entry points were sealed. Surveillance feeds were rerouted into a mobile command unit parked 2 blocks away. To anyone watching from the street, it looked like a routine maintenance shutdown. Inside, it was something else entirely. This was the moment a year-long investigation reached its breaking point. The building itself had never raised suspicion. It carried no signage, no flags, no markings that suggested anything more than a private administrative office tied to overseas trade coordination. Its tenants were polite, professional, and rarely drew attention. Deliveries arrived on schedule. Financial records were spotless. That was the problem. For months, analysts inside multiple federal agencies had been tracking irregular financial flows tied to international shipping corridors. The numbers didn't add up, not because they were messy, but because they were too clean. Every transfer was balanced, every shipment cleared inspection, every audit passed without issue. In the world of international logistics, that level of perfection doesn't exist. The anomaly appeared first in customs data. Containers moving through several U.S. ports showed identical clearance times, regardless of port congestion or staffing levels. That alone was suspicious. But when investigators overlaid the data with financial records, a deeper pattern emerged. The same small group of shell companies appeared again and again. Each company was registered legally. Each filed taxes. Each maintained compliance paperwork. And yet all of them were tied, through layered ownership structures, to a central entity connected to trade activity in the Gulf region, including Oman. That was the first red flag. The second came when analysts noticed that these companies were not just importing goods, they were moving value. Cryptocurrency transfers, commodity swaps, and digital asset conversions were being routed through the same network. Money moved in clean, deliberate cycles, never lingering long enough to trigger alerts. It was as if the system had been engineered to look invisible. When federal investigators began quietly monitoring the operation, they discovered something else. The shipping hub at the center of the network wasn't just moving goods. It was coordinating logistics, synchronizing arrivals, rerouting shipments, and managing timing across multiple jurisdictions. This wasn't a warehouse. It was a command center. By the time surveillance confirmed the scale of activity, the decision was made to move quickly. Too many digital assets, too many dependencies. If the network sensed exposure, it could dissolve overnight. At 2:14 a.m., the order was given. Federal teams moved in from 3 directions. Entry teams secured the outer perimeter, while cyber units cut external communications. Within minutes, agents were inside the facility, moving through corridors lined with offices that looked indistinguishable from any corporate suite. But behind locked doors, the truth surfaced. Hidden server rooms, encrypted storage arrays, detailed logs tracking shipments, transfers, and routing instructions. Wall-mounted displays showing real-time data feeds from ports, warehouses, and transit hubs around the world. The scope of the operation was staggering. Investigators quickly realized they weren't looking at a single criminal enterprise, but a distributed network designed to move illicit goods under the cover of legitimate trade. The estimated value of the operation exceeded $750 million, with transactions spanning multiple continents. And then came the arrests. In coordinated actions across multiple locations, 112 individuals were detained for questioning. Some were logistics coordinators. Others were financial intermediaries. A few were technical specialists responsible for maintaining the digital backbone of the operation. None of them matched the profile of a traditional criminal. They were professionals, analysts, consultants, managers. That, investigators realized, was the point. This network wasn't built on violence. It was built on structure. Every participant had a role. Every action was documented. Every risk was calculated. And every contingency had already been planned for. The deeper agents dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't an operation hiding from law enforcement. It was one that assumed law enforcement would never look in the right place. By dawn, the scale of the discovery was clear. Servers had been seized, financial accounts frozen, evidence cataloged. But the true impact of the operation was only beginning to surface. Because what had been uncovered wasn't just a crime. It was a blueprint, a demonstration of how global trade, modern finance, and bureaucratic systems could be woven together into something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. And as federal teams prepared to move into the next phase of the investigation, one question loomed over everything. How many more networks like this were still operating, unseen, untouched, and waiting? By the time the sun rose over the Capitol, the scale of the operation had begun to sink in. What investigators initially believed was a contained enforcement action had quickly evolved into something far more complex. The evidence recovered from the seized servers revealed a layered architecture, not just of criminal activity but of governance, procedures, redundancies, fail-safes. This wasn't an organization improvising to survive. It was a system designed to persist. As federal analysts reconstructed the data, patterns emerged that reshaped the entire investigation. Transaction records showed the same digital fingerprints appearing across multiple jurisdictions, often months apart, always following the same structure. Funds would enter through legitimate trade channels, cycle through a series of intermediary accounts, and re-emerge as clean capital tied to unrelated commercial activity. Every step complied with the letter of the law. It was the intention behind it that told a different story. The deeper analysts went, the more they realized the operation had been built to exploit not just financial systems, but trust itself. The network relied on compliance frameworks, regulatory thresholds, and jurisdictional boundaries as protective layers. The complexity wasn't a weakness, it was the shield. Within hours of the raid, federal agencies expanded their response. Quiet notifications were sent to oversight bodies, financial institutions, and port authorities across multiple states. Audits were initiated, accounts flagged, data streams frozen mid-transfer. Behind the scenes, task forces began mapping what they now understood to be a multi-tiered structure. At the base were service providers, logistics companies, consultants, and facilitators, whose roles appeared legitimate on paper. Above them sat coordination cells responsible for timing shipments, managing documentation, and maintaining operational continuity. And at the top, a small, insulated group that never touched physical goods, communicating only through encrypted channels. The most alarming discovery came from internal records recovered during the raid. They outlined contingency protocols. If a facility was compromised, operations would shift automatically to secondary hubs. If financial flows were interrupted, backup channels would activate. If personnel were detained, predefined replacement chains would step in. It was resilience by design. Investigators realized they weren't dismantling a network. They were peeling back layers of an architecture built to survive disruption. As the scope of the case expanded, federal leadership authorized a broader review of similar structures nationwide. Quiet audits began at shipping terminals, logistics firms, and commercial service providers whose activity matched the same digital fingerprints. Some cooperated immediately, others didn't. The findings were sobering. Across multiple regions, investigators identified parallel systems operating in similar fashion, not identical, but eerily familiar in design. The same compliance loopholes, the same transactional patterns, the same strategic use of legitimate frameworks to mask illicit flow. This was no coincidence. The operation uncovered in Washington was not an isolated entity. It was a proof of concept, and it had worked. By the time public awareness caught up, federal officials were already shifting their focus from enforcement to prevention. New oversight measures were drafted, interagency task forces were expanded, international partners were quietly brought into the fold. But even as these steps unfolded, investigators acknowledged a hard truth. The system they had uncovered had evolved faster than the mechanisms designed to stop it. The question was no longer how this network had operated undetected. The question was, how many others like it were already in motion? As one senior official would later describe it, this was not a story about criminals hiding in the shadows. It was about how modern systems, built for efficiency, trust, and speed, could be repurposed by those who understood them better than anyone else. And as the investigation moved into its next phase, one thing became clear. The operation in Washington wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a much larger reckoning. By the time the first wave of arrests became public, the scope of what had been uncovered was already forcing a quiet recalibration inside federal agencies. This was no longer treated as a conventional enforcement case. What investigators had uncovered wasn't simply a criminal enterprise exploiting weak oversight. It was a parallel system, one that had learned how to move alongside legitimate institutions without triggering alarms, audits, or suspicion. The more analysts reviewed the seized data, the clearer it became that the operation's strength lay in its invisibility. There were no encrypted chat apps flagged by intelligence agencies, no flashy money transfers, no sudden spikes in activity. Everything moved slowly, deliberately, and within expected ranges. The system didn't hide from oversight. It blended into it. In many ways, that was the most unsettling revelation. The network's designers had clearly studied how regulatory bodies work. They understood how audits were conducted, how risk thresholds were calculated, and how enforcement agencies prioritized targets. They built their system around those blind spots, ensuring it would never appear urgent enough to trigger scrutiny. It was camouflaged by compliance. As analysts reconstructed the organization's digital backbone, they discovered that the network had been stress-tested over time. Small disruptions were intentionally introduced to observe how authorities responded. When pressure increased in one area, activity shifted elsewhere. If a channel drew attention, it was quietly abandoned and replaced. Every move suggested long-term planning. The most concerning discovery came when investigators identified what they called the continuity framework, a set of protocols designed to ensure operations could continue even if leadership was removed. Each operational cell functioned independently but followed the same blueprint. Communication between cells was minimal and highly controlled. Even if one segment collapsed, the rest could continue without interruption. This wasn't a criminal group reacting to law enforcement. It was a system engineered to survive it. As the scope of the findings became clear, federal agencies began coordinating beyond traditional boundaries. Intelligence units, financial regulators, and cybercrime divisions were brought together under a single task framework. Information sharing restrictions were loosened. New analytical tools were deployed. What they uncovered raised uncomfortable questions. The network had not relied on corruption or coercion to function. It had relied on competence, on understanding how modern institutions work and how to operate within them without drawing attention. In effect, it had turned compliance into camouflage. The implications were enormous. If one organization could build such a system, others could too. And if those systems remained undetected for years, the challenge facing enforcement was no longer about catching criminals. It was about identifying the invisible structures that allowed them to thrive. By the time the operation reached its final phase, the focus had shifted away from arrests and toward prevention. Authorities began reassessing how trade data was monitored, how financial flows were flagged, and how oversight mechanisms could be strengthened without disrupting legitimate commerce. But even as these efforts unfolded, officials acknowledged a sobering reality. The operation they dismantled was likely not unique. It was a prototype, a demonstration of what modern criminal networks could achieve when they combined legal expertise, financial sophistication, and technological precision. And as one senior investigator quietly remarked, the most dangerous aspect wasn't what had been uncovered. It was what might still be operating undetected. The case would eventually be closed. Reports would be filed. Systems would be updated. But the lessons would linger because the world had changed. And in that new reality, the most dangerous threats were no longer the ones that operated in the shadows, but those that learned how to hide in plain sight. If you want to stay ahead of the stories they don't want you to see, subscribe now. More investigations are already unfolding, and the next one will go even deeper. Stay alert, stay informed, and don't miss what comes next.